So in terms of the midterm, it will be structured, as I think I mentioned, 13 questions, answer 10 of them. You can answer more if you like, but I'll count 10. Each one will be, if my math is correct, worth roughly 10 to add up to 100. I'm not going to be finicky and picking on grammar and take points off if you spell a word wrong, because probably that's how we spell it in Britain anyway, so that's fine. And that's a basic outline of what you should expect. I'm not looking for long paragraph answers. I'm not going to be upset if you put them. So if you get carried away and you're enjoying the material and you want to write a paragraph, I'm not going to take marks off because, oh my gosh, they're giving me so much reading to do that's hurting my eyes. So don't worry about that. But if you can answer the question in 3 words, you should feel free to do that without thinking, is this a trick? Am I not doing enough? And the questions are not intended to be complex moments of creativity, but really recall. But of course, you can be creative if you like. I'm not here to suppress any of that, but I don't want this to be stressful for anybody. So what I would say to bear in mind is that this is going to be, we've had now, I think, 12 maybe sessions. So they're going to be 13 questions. Roughly a question a session. Obviously, I've got to pick 2 from 1 at some point. Oh, the truth is we have class on Thursday. So there you go, 1 from there. And so it'll be roughly a question a session. Something that's going to be obviously overtly discussed, not buried somewhere in a canto that we didn't touch on. So in terms of thinking roughly over the course of the last few weeks, think about the letter to Can Grande that we read right at the start. What were Dante's central claims? Think about some of the contextual history, what was happening politically on the ground, who were the major forces fighting over authority and power, what were the influences over the Inferno, what were the sources, culturally speaking, maybe some of the names of the major influences, not the minor influences that we kind of mentioned in passing, to think about. We spent a couple of sessions on the landscape of hell, the division between the circles and the different areas. We spent a little bit of time in the process of that doing some Aristotelian thought. What does he consider to be the way to live ethically? How does he define terms that we use colloquially, but not in his technical sense? How the medieval tradition tended to reinterpret Aristotle and how Dante is feeding off that reinterpretation to describe the shape of hell. We then turn to the Inferno itself, and we're going to think about in Canto 1, just in terms of the narrative, what happens where Dante wakes up? Who does he meet along the way? Think about who occupies the different areas of hell that we've come across so far. In Canto 2, that was really a continuation of Canto 1, where Dante is still talking to his guide about whether this is necessary, why he should go, if he's fitting to go on this trip through the underworld and then back up to paradise. But then we got to Canto 3, where we get to the vestibule of hell. Who's in there? Why are they in there? We get to Canto 4 and Circle 1, which is a very odd place in hell, where Dante has some radical arguments that make him stand out from Christian tradition on that kind of first circle of hell. We then got to Canto 5, which is where we were last time, where we started. And in many ways, that kind of brings us to where we are now, which we'll turn to in a moment as we introduce today's material. But that's just kind of roughly speaking, the kind of issues, questions, nothing too probing, just to kind of make sure that we're on top of the material that we've discussed in class, so that we are trying to integrate it into our memory cells. That's the main objective. And there's probably, I see a couple of hands went up, probably 2 words that you want to hear, that if any of that worried you, you're going to take a little breath and go, I can't believe I asked for that to be recorded. What 2 words might you be wanting?
Open book.
Incorrect. Well,
Sefer Patuach.
there you go. Yeah, that's just a terminological thing.
Sefer Patuach.
Sefer Patuach. There you go. The Book of the Apple. You said Sefer Tapuach. There you go. All right. So, yes, let me state it like this. Since we are still toward the end, hopefully, of the pandemic, but we're still in a place where I think everybody's anxiety and stress levels are elevated. Maybe it's projection, and as students, it feels pretty run of the mill, but my sense is in the ether of the atmosphere is anxiety levels. So I'm going to do everything that I can in my limited power to try not to elevate people's stress. So it is my intention for this to be open notes, which means, or open book, if that helps you. I just was thinking of the words open notes, which means if you want to share notes, that's fine. What I would really appreciate is not to have like a Google Doc where one person does the exam and then shares it with everybody else, because that will be evident to me and will bore me to death. And it will also defeat the object. And again, the object of this, and 1 second. So I expect you to take this all very seriously. Otherwise, there's big risk. Yes. Yes, you heard it. I think Benzi is quite pumped for this midterm. I didn't see the previous chats, but it seems to have gone wild here. Oh, you were taking notes? Excellent. There you go. So that's for people to see. You should feel free to see those notes. I know I may be wrong, but I'm sure some of you have taken type notes as we've been doing this. And you should feel free, if you're comfortable, sharing your notes. I know not everybody is comfortable doing that. You should feel free from my account. Okay. I hope that's helpful. We'll meet at 3 o'clock on Zoom. I will email out the questions. I'll also put it in the chat, and then we'll finish at 4:15 whenever we normally finish, and you'll send it back to me. And I will endeavor to do my best to have grades back as quickly as possible. There's no need for it to hang over our shoulders. Okay, is that clear? Any questions, any thoughts, comments, critiques? Happy to take. Yes, Jonah.
So just review. So the midterm is going to be on cantos 1 to 12.
Wherever we get up to this Thursday, I'm aiming to get past 11, get to the end of 11 by Thursday. Yeah. Which is exciting, because if we're up to 11, that means we're a third of the way through hell, which is great. I mean, in terms of cantos, by the end of Thursday, we'll be 6 circles through hell. So you may be wondering, why is a third got us 2/3 of the way through? And oh boy, what is waiting for him in lower hell, which will be intriguing to say the least. Another hand I saw? Yes, Benny.
And just to confirm, it's next Tuesday?
Correct. Next Tuesday, I think that's March 9th. If today's the 2nd. Yeah. Everything clear? Any more questions? This is not Speak Now, Forever Hold Your Peace. We'll meet again on Thursday, and you can email me anytime. Okay. So let us dive into today's material. I am recording. Good. Okay, so let's try to remind ourselves what we did last time. Last time we did cantos 5 and nearly all of canto 6, which led us through circles 2 and 3 of hell. Canto 5 was dedicated to the sin of lust, where Dante enters this storm-filled cave where he sees, like starlings that YouTube I showed you of, the starlings floating in the wind in a kind of mesmerizing pattern, was how he saw these bodies. And that's going to be important as we continue today. These are not really, I mean, they're not really bodies, but they're not quite souls either. There are forms here with limbs that can seem to experience pain, as we saw in Canto 6. The bodies are being ripped by Cerberus the dog. There's blood, there's pain, there's anguish being experienced here. So in that first canto last time, we saw lust being experienced in a whirlwind of pain where they're literally swept about against their will all the time. And we noted how radical this was on the part of Dante, because traditional texts that had depicted those who had sinned with lust had depicted them kind of strung up by the limbs associated with lust, and it was seen as a sexual deviancy. And what Dante does is he puts these sinners, again, and it's kind of hard not to, it's hard not to want to overstate this, that he takes the case of adultery, and not just adultery, but adultery with a brother-in-law, and puts them in essentially the lowest punishable circle of hell. The kind of crime that we associate probably in the Jewish mind with figures like Zimri and Cosby, or with the in Vayikra, the list of sexual crimes, the arayos that we read on Yom Kippur afternoon, those are kind of the high crimes in Jewish thought that Dante puts at the lowest punishable ebb of hell. Meaning the next circle we get to are people who eat too quickly. People who eat too quickly get more punishment than the people who commit adultery with family members. That's what was so astonishing. And that's radical, number one, in the positioning, in the hierarchy of the sin, but also in terms of the punishment. We noted that traditional punishment was to see them kind of strung up by sexual limbs, and he puts them in a wind in what we said was a desexualization of the sin of lust. He says, I'm really not that focused on the limbs, the act in particular. This is about the loss of will. This is about caving to the sense that I don't have choice. It is an abdication of moral responsibility. It is a disavowal of the power of the intellect. That is really the sin. And he uses the example of Francesca and Paolo, who get into a conversation with him, and Francesca reports that they were reading a book and they were just taken by lust, literally seized by the scenes that they were reading, and it forced them to do this. They could not help it. Love conquers all. And of course, that idea, that courtly idea that love is unconquerable, was not conquered by Dante's hell, Inferno. It has lived. It lives today in Hollywood. It lives everywhere. And we just think about something as totally detached as Fiddler on the Roof, where essentially there's an argument being made that if two people fall in love, who should get it? Who can get in the way of that? The forces of the cosmos conspire so that love can unfold naturally. And Dante's claim here is that that's a cop-out. That's a cop-out. Yes, we all have desires, urges. We can get infatuated. We can feel that we are falling in love. But his claim, by putting lust at the bottom of hell, is twofold. Number one, we noted this last time, it's twofold. Number one, yes, this is an immense power to overcome, which is why it is so low in hell. Not because it's a less consequential sin, but we have less control. And there is an admission there that we do have less control over how we fall in love, who we fall in love with, and how we express it. But we do have some control, which is why it's at the high end of incontinence, in the sense that we just lose control. So we've got a high responsibility to try and keep ourselves in check. And really the sin is not one of a deviant kind of bodily, fleshy nature. It is the failure to exhibit intellectual power. Did I see a hand, a question, Josh? I can't hear you. I don't, could anybody else hear? Was that me?
No.
Okay, no, we couldn't hear you. You've now muted yourself. It could be you need headphones. Okay, so as you're plugging in, I'll just finish off what we did in that circle, and then you can jump in. We had a look for a few moments at the Gemara in Kiddushin, where we had a couple of tales of Rav Meir, Rabbi Akiva, and Rav Amram, who all initially, well, not all actually, Rav Meir and Rabbi Akiva mocked those who sinned and said, they're so weak, how could they do that? And then the Satan comes along, dresses up as a woman, presumably in a convincing way, despite being on top of a palm tree or across a river. And these sages, these pious figures, got enwrapped in lust, essentially, until, in the case of two of them, Rav Meir and Akiva, halfway through, the Satan basically said, I had you, and I'm going to let you go. because they talk so highly of you in heaven, so I'm going to let you go. Which is, as a side point, an interesting understanding of how Satan works. If Satan, as we'll see in Dante's conception, was a rebel against God, who tries to trick up humanity for the sake of spite, of course, you can't imagine him turning around in the middle of his task and saying, I'm going to let you go. But of course, the rabbinic idea of Satan is quite different to the Christian idea of Satan. For more on that, have a look at the Strauss Center video that was sent out Rosh Hashanah time about Satan in Milton and in the Rosh Hashanah Tefillot in the liturgy. Either way, but that's the first two cases. We became with men. Then we had Rav Amram, who Satan was not quite involved in an explicit way, but he stops himself. Halfway up a ladder, he shouts and he says, fire, 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 which of course is a ploy, a strategy to get people to come in and stop him, but also an evocative way of describing that there is a fire in his house, in Beit Amram. There's a fire in him that he needs putting out. And of course, that's when the Satan or the Yetzer Hara leaves him. And he says, I'm greater than you because you're fire and I'm flesh and I won. Which goes to say that the truth is there's not that much of a gap between rabbinic thought and Dante on this idea. And the fact that we do read the Arayot on Yom Kippur, and the fact that the punishments for infidelity are so severe in terms of earthly punishment doesn't necessarily mean that they are the worst punished sins in the afterlife in Olam Haba, however we want to think about it. It's quite possible that on earth, HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants us to enact certain rules and laws and punishments precisely because it's so hard to control, and we need to put fences up, not because we're most liable and it makes us the most depraved beings on earth. Again, for Dante, people who cheat on their taxes are worse than people who sleep with their in-laws. Is that true in Jewish tradition? I don't know. It's not true in terms of the way the Beit Din would punish it, but it's possibly true the way that Hashem sees it, and that's reflected in our discussion. But of course, I can't speak for God. Talking of God, Josh, you had a question?
Can you hear me? Or
Yes.
yeah. So I was just wondering how, in terms of the first point, that Dante seems to take away the severity of the sin and more focuses on the mindset of just kind of giving into your desire, not controlling yourself. How does that seem to fit with what we were saying, the difference between Aristotle and Dante in terms of Dante's greater focus on the severity of sin as opposed to the cultivation or the improper cultivation of the mindset?
Oh, so that's helpful. That's interesting. So I mean, it would be helpful if it wasn't interesting. It'd be interesting if it wasn't even helpful. But it happens to be both. That, and because it's going to help me clarify. For Dante, this is not saying that there is a mindset that is practiced repeatedly for these people. Francesca and Paolo were not habitual adulterers. As far as we can tell, they committed this act once and then were killed by her husband. So it's not like these were serial adulterers. The claim is still, there was one moment, there was one lapse, there was one sin, and it was done in an unrepentant way. But what is the nature of the sin for Dante? The nature of the sin here is a lapse of mentality rather than kind of a fleshy, carnal experience. So that's helpful indeed. And I will note that this is not the last time we get adulterers in Dante's hell. The focus here is that this was a sin of lust. There are other times where people can commit adultery for other reasons. People can commit adultery with someone they have, again, I don't mean this to be a bawdy conversation, but people can commit adultery not for the sake of lust, but for the sake of political intrigue. They want to tear a family apart. They want to climb the ladder of power, so they sleep with the right, whatever you want to call it. There are other motives. And what's key for Dante is that sin with Francesca was about lust, which is why it's a sin of incontinence. If somebody commits infidelity and they do it with the intellectual intent that I'm in control of my faculties and I'm doing this for a particular aim, that's an entirely different sin, even though the act itself seems to be the same. So in the traditional Christian hell, where everybody who sins with the flesh gets hung up by those limbs, Dante's making a distinction where we're not interested in the act per se. We're acting in the nature of the sin or the vice. And in the context of lust, it is the abdication of mental moral responsibility. And in the case of doing it for other purposes, it is the betrayal of the intellect. Yes, Benzi.
How is he able to judge like one's intentions? Like a person could just justify that they're doing it for a different reason.
Right. So there is an assumption on his part of what we're going to call the omniscient narrator, meaning he knows everything and he's writing as if he knows everything, and he can't, and he has justification because this is the afterlife. So presumably the people who are there, God put there. So God knows the intention. But you're right. If he were describing a journey on earth, and this falls apart, there are movies made in Hollywood now. I can't remember what it was called. There was one where some guy basically went around hunting people for their sins. Horrific, sadistic guy who would shoot people and I can't remember what it was called. I don't know if I even saw it, if I just saw somebody in my house when I was a teenager watching it. But you're right, when a human being goes around, there are fallibility issues. We've just seen in the news over the last few weeks, tens of people being let out of jail because they were found guilty, given sentences on false evidence or faulty evidence. But assumption is when you're in the down under and in the world of fiction, you have a bit more surety of why people are there. So that's a good question and clarification. So after we got through lust, we got onto, and I see time is against us again, which is my fault. Well, actually, it's just a condition of life on earth, but it's my fault for not bearing that in mind too much. Canto 6, we then got to gluttony, which was far more horrific in terms of being blown around in a wind. I'm sure it's not fun, but being ripped out and shredded by a three-headed crazy dog while you're being rained on by filth and grime and slime and rolling in the mud, blinded. That is, I imagine, far more graphic. And in fact, we'll have Dante say there, however worse the punishments may get, the further down I go, none can be more disgusting. This is horrific, nauseating, which in many ways is meant to elicit the opposite of the sin of gluttony. We spoke in broad terms about the Christian tradition's view of gluttony, and actually here we had a moment where Jewish thought and even Dante's version of Christianity diverged. We had some overlap when it comes to neutrality and the sin of staying quiet in the times of a moral crisis. We had an overlap in terms of limbo, where there are some who are not quite, who don't quite meet the most rigorous religious standards, who are deserving of reward. We had some overlap when it comes to lust being an incredibly powerful force that is focused on our will. And here when it comes to gluttony, there's just, and maybe this falls into the stereotype of Jews and food, but there just isn't quite the same overlap where eating too quickly or eating too much or eating expensive food is seen as a stain on the soul. Of course, there are different traditions, let's say, on this. There are aesthetic traditions in Jewish thought that say you shouldn't eat anything ever. And you should try to limit that. And you should fast, every Monday and Thursday, etc. But there are lots of other traditions that suggest otherwise. And in fact, we have a Sudat mitzvah to celebrate a religious occasion. Yortzeit, there's usually a fast, or there was until we managed to find a way to turn that into a l'chaim as well. But we celebrate with food, and there's nothing, there's no problem, antagonism within the dynamic of gluttony in Jewish thought. Everything is in moderation. We did note that the Rambam Maimonides on a number of occasions in Hilchot Deot, in the matters of etiquette and ethics, notes about how it's proper to eat not just for the sake of pleasure. Of course, you get pleasure, but also for other purposes, for health, to make sure that we have energy. And on times of celebration, like a Sudat mitzvah, we shouldn't do it in a self-indulgent way and lock our doors, but we should find a way to invite other people in. And I'll say, in the wake of Purim, of course, even that is not easy. My wife and I in our home now, we have bags and bags and bags of candy and stuff which is trash for us. And every time I walk past that pile, I think, okay, I'll eat something, because why not? It's sitting here. And then my wife will say, well, why don't we give some of it away? You know, we've got the cleaning lady come or the babysitter come. And part of me is like, no, it's my food. I want my food. It's not easy to give it away. But of course, I don't believe that I'm going to suffer too much in eternity for that problematic attitude that I should probably adapt anyway. Okay, so that was where we got to in gluttony. And now we turn, I'm going to share my screen as we continue to finish off Canto 6. What is going on here? Can you see anything? Did I share the wrong screen? I did share the wrong screen. Can you see now? Excellent. So we got into the circle of gluttony and we moved past Cerberus, who the three-headed dog, who we said that Dante appeased not Dante, that Virgil appeased by throwing dirt into his mouth, again, indicative that really this is nothingness that they're focused on. He then continues walking and he comes across a particular figure who sticks his head up. And this is Dante's reaction to what's going on. Tell me who you are, who are put here in so painful a place and have such punishment that if any is greater, none is so disgusting. That's what I noted before, that this is a nauseating experience. He sees these people rolling in muck and mud and grime. He said to me, this guy who stuck his head up said, your city, which is so full of envy that the sack already overflows, kept me with her during my sunny life. Your citizens called me Zacco. Because of the damnable sin of the gullet, as you see, I am broken by the rain. He's essentially saying, I was guilty of gluttony. I'm from the city of Florence, your city, and your city is full of envy. And here Dante actually takes a move toward what we have described as the more Jewish rather than Christian attitude to gluttony. So he starts to allegorize gluttony. He does call it the sin of the gullet. Now we start moving into the realm of metaphor, where he talks about greed and envy and spite for power, as opposed to just talking about pure food. And this is what Dante said. He responded, I replied, Chaco, your trouble weighs on me so that it calls me to weep, but tell me if you know to what will come to the citizens of the divided city. And this is the first time Dante sees an opportunity to have a conversation with a resident of hell about back on earth, because this is being timed 1300. Dante's still in Florence in the writer's imagination, and Dante's writing this in exile, of course, but he's imagining this happening when he's the pilgrim in the year 1300. He's not been exiled yet. He's in the middle of Florentine society. He's functioning as a politician, and he's now turning to somebody in hell. He's got an opportunity to say, what's the future of this city that you now say is so full of envy? And of course, Dante understands is, as we spoke about in the, I think, class 2, when we spoke about the changes politically in the 1200s in Florence, as there was more international commerce, there were fights between emperors and popes. As the nation state was starting to develop, more power was available, more influence and more greed, and Florence bursted, it seems, in terms of its population. So Dante says, what's the future here? In many ways that we as a species have been trying to figure out over the last 6 decades, since there has been a human population explosion. What does the future hold? There's a lot of antagonism, there's a lot of hostility, but there's a lot of promise. What's happening? What's the future? Number one, if there is any just. Second question he asks, is there anybody back in Florence who is worthy? And this, of course, is a trope used in many religious traditions. I'm sure some come to mind for you in the Talmud, where we've got a figure who finally has the opportunity to speak to someone who can speak to the future or speak to the depth of souls and say, is there anybody here who's righteous? Anyone know what I'm talking about? Gemara, when somebody asks somebody, is there anybody here righteous? See Gemara in Tanit and elsewhere, where Reb Shua ben Levi turns to Eliyahu Navi and says, is anybody in the market here? Is anybody here Ben Olam Haba? Eliyahu Navi says, nope. Oh, hold on a minute. 2 guys just walked in. Oh, there's another guy. And of course, it's quite telling what their roles are. We'll leave that for another time. But either way, he now asks, is there anybody just back in Florence right now? And tell me the reason so much discord has assailed it. 3 questions he asks this guy, which again, this is not an oracle. This is not a prophet. This is a guy suffering in the third circle of hell, but he seems to have information and an identity as he suffers. And he calls out, I was called Siaco in your city. So this is Dante's chance to reflect, and he asks 3 questions. Number 1, what's the future hold for Florence? Number 2, is anybody there righteous? And number 3, how did this all start? And he says, okay, here's your answer. 2 are just. Yes, there are 2 people in Florence who are just. We're not told who they are. Who do you imagine one of them might be?
Dante?
Yeah. So a number of the commentators suggest that Dante is implying himself as one of them, and, one more for good measure. No one heeds them, but no one listens to the 2 just people in Florence. Pride, envy, and greed are the 3 sparks that have set hearts ablaze. And it's those 3 that have caused the problem: pride, envy, and greed. He hasn't quite answered the question about the future, but he does in kind of vague terms about how it will be ripped apart. There will be war and collision. And then Dante says, what about Farinato and Tegiao, who were so worthy? Jacopo, Rustucci, Arrigo, and Mosca, and the others who turned their wits to doing well. Dante now turns around and says, but you said there are only 2 just people in Florence, but what about these guys? I work with them. I meet with them. I talk with them. Surely they did good. Tell me where they are and cause me to know them, for great desire urges me to understand if heaven sweetens or hell poisons them. And then Ciacco responds and says, they are among the blacker souls. You thought they were good? They were just deceiving you, my friend. They were blacker souls. Various sins weigh them toward the bottom. If you descend so far, you can see them there. But when you are back in the sweet world, I beg you, bring me to people's minds. No more do I say to you, and no more do I answer you. He said, okay, I'm done now. I've told you what I've got to say. The people who you thought were good, they're burning far deeper than I am, because they deceived you. They were intellectual sinners. They weren't quite as base. I was, the tavern idiot that went drinking and eating every night. But those people who you thought were doing well were siphoning funds off. They were betraying their friends. They're burning much deeper than I am. Pride, envy, and greed are the problems. And then he said, and mention my name. Mention my name. It seems to be that immortality can be found in remembering your story, which again reinforces the punishment that seems so light for those who are stuck in the vestibule, who live in anonymity as neutrals. You think they got off quite easy. And here Dante's trying to find another way to concretize the pain of an eternal anonymity. It's true that Ciacco is being shredded by Cerberus, but I've just said his name 6 times. And that anonymous Celestine V, whose name I just said as well, but we're not sure is the guy, has got no legacy at all. And in many ways, that absence, that hollowness is worse than the presence of pain if you've got a name. He then finishes again in a graphic way, his direct eyes and twisted into oblique ones, meaning Ciacco was looking directly at me, and I think I'm looking into the camera. And then in a moment, he kind of twisted and looked like that, which is a signal again of something untoward. And then he stared at me a little and bent his head with it. He fell level with the other blind one. So you imagine this guy kind of speaking oracular desperation, begging to be named on earth, speaking about the future, the problems of Florence rather, and then kind of falling back into the mud and rolling around and being rained upon. And that brings us to the end of Canto 6 and circle number 3. Now we get to circle number 4, Canto 7. What's Canto 7? What's circle number 4? Circle number 4, avarice and prodigality. Avarice, anyone know the difference between avarice and prodigality? Anyone want to define, roughly speaking, those terms? So, I can't see if anybody raised their hand. Avarice is essentially another term for greed, particularly in terms of wealth. Avarice is kind of hoarding money, making lots of money and keeping it to yourself. That's avarice. Another term for that that's probably more colloquial is stingy. What's another word for stingy? Tight, whatever word you want to say. I don't share my money with other people. I've got kind of this attachment to wealth. Prodigality is the opposite. It's somebody who is a big spender, who just kind of throws money around and says, I'm going to buy this, I'm going to buy that, I'm going to buy that. It just kind of is constantly doesn't see the value of money. So you've got two opposites here. And we're going to see in a moment, again, or I'll mention it now, this is somewhat radical on the part of Dante. For traditional Christian tradition, money is the root of evil. Avarice is one of the 7 deadly sins. Prodigality is not involved. Someone who spends money without thinking about it, in some ways, that's almost a virtue because you don't care about the value of money. It's not important to you. You're not attached to earth. But for Dante, part of his, and I don't mean agenda in a negative way, in a pejorative way, but part of his intellectual agenda, his aim here, is to communicate the need for responsible, virtuous politics on earth, not to run away and flee the world into caves and mountainsides for meditation, but to find a way to organize society in an ethical way. So for him to just have in the same circle as avarice those who are guilty of prodigality is making a statement that it's not about an attachment to wealth. It's about an imbalance in relation to wealth. That's the problem. Avarice is the attachment and prodigality is a detachment, and both extremes are a problem for him. So we'll come that to more detail. And what is going to be unique so far in our experience of hell is that there are 2 circles we meet in this same canto, which kind of blends the line. Because by the end of Canto 7, we're already on the verge of the 5th circle, the circle of wrath or anger. So we'll come to both of those. This here on your screen is Gustave Doré's depiction of the figure that Dante and Virgil meet as they first get to this 4th circle, named Plutus, a Roman god of wealth, who kind of stands up, and the opening words of the canto are these indecipherable, they're not Italian, they're indecipherable syllables. He says, Pape Satan, Pepe Satan, Alepe. And nobody knows what it means. In the translation in the English you had, it just has those words written. And there are tens and tens of different explanations of what it means. Some see it as like a magical summoning charm for Satan, who's in the middle of hell. Some see it as an attempt to speak gutturally in ancient Hebrew, alape being close to aleph, and he's kind of some primitive figure. But what we do know for sure is that it's ambiguous, that communication is failing, that he's almost become and it even calls it, if I'm not incorrect, clucking noises. This is him essentially being an animal. And this is warning us for a number of the scholars that as we enter the realm that discusses the problems with wealth, Dante's major claim again is going to be that imbalance around wealth corrodes rationality. It corrodes our ability to think and communicate and essentially be human in a responsible way. And that's why you've got this big kind of gargantuan figure, Plutus, the god of wealth, kind of muttering. So, well, surely a businessman who knows how to manage wealth should speak in an articulate way. But it is the imbalance around wealth that leads the god of wealth to speak in this inarticulate way. Dante is obviously, as he enters this realm, horrified, intimidated, scared of this figure. Virgil says, oh, don't worry about it. We're clear. You keep coming up against these monsters who don't want to let you in. Cerberus didn't want to let you in. Charon didn't want to let you in to come across the Acheron originally. Now Plutus doesn't want to. Just relax. You can come with me. And he turns to Plutus in, for those of you who saw Lord of the Rings, the same way that Gandalf turns to that, what's that big thing from the fire? What is it called? The Balrog. There you go. I don't know if anybody's seen this or it's just me. Sees that big fiery monster and he says, you shall not pass. And then it kind of falls apart. He turns to Plutus and he basically says, shut your face. I'm not interested in you. Back to the shadows, right? He says, go away, you wolf. And he collapses like a boat that's mast collapses and the sail falls. All the wind's taken out and he collapses. This is him collapse. And Dante and Virgil enter this realm. And I've tried again to block some of this off, where there are these figures just pushing rocks around. In this respect, I don't know how many of you have seen the movie Wall Street. I confess not to have seen it all, but there is a quite well-known speech Michael Douglas gives toward the end of it, defending greed. Tell me if you can hear this.
Ladies and gentlemen, that greed, for lack of a better word, is good. Greed is right. Greed works. Greed clarifies, cuts through, and captures the essence of the evolutionary spirit. Greed in all of its forms. Greed for life, for money, for love, knowledge, has marked the upward surge of mankind, and greed, you mark my words, will not only save Teldar Paper, but that other malfunctioning corporation called the USA. Thank you very much.
And that speech written into the movie Wall Street was actually pinched from a commencement speech given by a figure who I can't remember, who essentially turned, I think in the late 90s, to a group of graduating students and said, greed is good. When you leave and you've got your degree, use greed to propel yourself, because it has essentially determined the success, the prosperity of humankind. Does that sound like a Jewish argument? And I don't mean all Jews would agree. Does it sound like any argument that a Jew could give? No. Okay, anyone disagree? I see some no's. Anyone think maybe? All right, well, something to bear in mind as you think it through. I mean, if we change the word greed for the word Yetzer Hara, would that make it more complicated? The Yetzer Hara is good. Yetzer Hara for money, for love. I see some changed faces now. Is the Yetzer Hara good? Okay, Josh thinks good. Okay, he's on the Yetzer Hara side. Good to know. Go on, jump in, and then Jonah.
I mean, there's a lot of indications in Chazal that you should serve Kadosh Baruch Hu with Shnei Yitzreich, both your Yetzer Tov and Yetzer Hara, and there's even a whole sefer dedicated called Orchos HaTzadikim to showing how each midah could be used positively and negatively.
Excellent, Jonah.
Yeah, like kind of the same thing. Like the Yetzer Hara is something that can be evil, but it also can be neutral. So you just have to channel it in the right direction. Kind of the same idea.
Excellent. And in fact, there is a Gemara that says that Chazal at one point tried to get rid of the Yetzer Hara. They locked it up. And of course, what happened? I'm sure many of you are familiar with
There were no eggs left anymore.
There were no eggs, meaning the chickens didn't have eggs. Nobody built houses. No, without Yetzer Hara, again, I don't mean to say that this is a direct overlap, but without impulse and urge for self-interest, for lust, for preservation, for money, we tend to become inactive. We tend to fall into inertia. So, of course, the idolatry of greed sounds astonishingly evil. But there is a sense in which the human urges are necessary. I'm not sure if we would say, as a result of that, the Yetzer Hara is good. I think we might say the Yetzer Hara is necessary, which is, I think, where we have a huge chasm between Michael Douglas's speech and Jewish tradition. But what we'll see, again, Dante is kind of in between the extremes here, where greed is good for Michael Douglas, and what we'll see in a moment, Christian tradition that essentially sees greed, certainly around wealth, as prohibitive to living a righteous life. What we have here, Dante walks in, he says, I saw more people more numerous than before, meaning from all those gluttons and all those who do lust, there are far more people who are interested around wealth, in being impious. On one side and the other, with great cries, rolling weights by force of their chests, meaning it's not quite accurate the way Dore has this here with them pushing with their hands. The way Dante depicts it is these figures with basically their hands by their side. They're heaving these huge rocks with their chests, just pushing them forward. And it's not always easy to draw out the picture from his words, but he says there are essentially two circles of people pushing boulders with their chest toward each other. They collide and then they turn around and go back the other way. They collide, and then right there, each one reversing directions, look back and say, why do you hold and why do you toss? Meaning you've got these two groups, the avaricious on the one hand and the prodigal on the other, those who cleave to their material wealth and those who kind of flush it away, come to each other, they bump into each other and they say, why do you hold so much money? And the other one say, well, why'd you give it all away? And then they turn around and they just go the other direction. And it is a perpetual, almost mechanical pain where they just push around meaningless loads for no reason. I will note this is probably reminiscent of one of the punishments in Greek myth. Anyone familiar with a Greek mythic figure who was punished by pushing a boulder continually? Sounds like a disease.
Push it, hit to push it to the top of a mountain, and then it would roll down.
Excellent. So that's the, say again, Jonah? Sisyphus, indeed. Syphilis is a disease or an illness. Sisyphus was the Greek mythic figure who was tormented in Greek myth by having to push a boulder up a mountain. It would roll down, and then have to push it up again. It would roll down, have to push it up, and it would roll down again. In fact, Albert Camus, a French existentialist from the 20th century, wrote a book called The Myth of Sisyphus, essentially saying that is resonant with his idea of what human life is like. In a world where secularism became rampant, where faith became empty for a lot of people, we live in a world where, I don't know if the majority of humanity, but the majority of Westerners probably lean toward atheism. And you've got Albert Camus writing The Myth of Sisyphus is essentially the character of human life. We just toil aimlessly all the time. If there's no sense of final redemption, if there's no sense of engaging with God, if there's no sense of an afterlife, if there's no real purpose, I'm just getting up every day and slogging through the day and filling my needs to eat and relieve and sleep. And why? It's just meaningless. That's a Sisyphean idea of existentialism, which is, of course, in 20th century thought. So we'll leave that because we're still in the 12th century. But this is markedly different to Sisyphus, because even the myth of Sisyphus, which Dante, of course, is drawing on, he's pushing it up a mountain. So to some degree, there is accomplishment. It's just futile because he has to keep doing it again. And a number of scholars have observed in this circle of hell, in circle 4, the prodigal and avaricious have to push kind of on this flat plane. Again, Dore has put an incline here, but that's not the way Dante describes it. It's just horizontal, meaningless, mechanical pushing, where they bump into each other and go back and forth continually. And Dante says, Master, among this last kind, I should certainly be able to recognize someone with soil. He says, look, I'm living in Florence. You heard what Chaco just said about Florence. I know what the Florentines are like. I've got to recognize a few people. I know the guy sat behind me in shul. He's definitely in this circle. He wouldn't give a money, a cent to any of the appeals. And then Virgil again, and this is part of Dante's education, that not giving money deprives you of something else. Whereas Charco, you could recognize his features. Francesco, you could have a conversation. You get to this circle, and there's something fundamentally new, not just in the punishment, but in the condition of the souls. He says, you're gathering an empty thought. The undiscerning life that befouled them makes them now dark to all recognition. They were undiscerning. They didn't recognize the value of money, meaning they didn't recognize that it had value and worth. So some of them spent it without thinking, and some of them didn't recognize its value as a means to an end and clutched it tight. And because they were undiscerning in life, their facial figures have disappeared. You can't recognize them. So it's not quite the anonymity you have of the neutral figures, but it's a new kind of anonymity, not where their names are prohibited to be uttered, but you just can't recognize their faces. They've become so immured in their vice, they can't be seen. For eternity, they will have these two buttings going back and forth. Bad giving and bad keeping has deprived them. Again, here Dante balances that. It's not just bad keeping, it's bad giving. They gave too much, they kept too much. Half these figures, they just don't know how to balance the meaning and the value of money and wealth. It deprived them of the lovely world. And because they were so focused on the imbalance in relation to wealth, they could not appreciate beauty in the world. And beauty in the world, one might associate with having lots of wealth, but he's saying that is, of course, a corruption of beauty. They never got to focus on what's really meaningful on earth because they were obsessed with money. There was another movie. It was made, I guess, 15 years ago. I can't remember what it's called, and I would have checked. I just thought of it now, about the man who designed the circuit for windscreen wipers for cars. I'm sure many of you drive when it rains. Do you call them windscreen wipers? I don't know what you call them. Wipers?
Windshield.
What'd you say, Ruben?
Windshield wipers.
Windshield wipers, right. He designed the algorithm and the circuit for it to work on repeat. And basically people copied him and said, you didn't create anything. You just move things around in a circuit. There's a resistor, there's a circuit closer, there's a switch. You put it in a new order, well done. But all those bits were there. This is not called copying, and he took them to court and he sued them, etc. And it's a fascinating movie, fascinating legal case. And eventually he won the case, and he got all the royalties, and all these companies were penalized for stealing his idea. But at the end of the movie, you discover that his family's fallen apart, that because he was so obsessed with prosecuting this case and defending his wealth, he ended up ripping his family to shreds. And on many occasions, there's a scene when his wife says, just give it up. It's not worth it. We don't need the money. And he said, on principle, I need this, I need it. And again, so to some degree, that's just illustrative of this point, that bad keeping and bad giving deprived them of the lovely world and set them to this scuffling, whatever it is. I prettify no words for it. Now you can see, my son, the brief mockery of the goods that are committed to fortune, for which the human race have squabbled, for all the gold that is under the moon and that ever was, could not give rest to even one of these weary souls. Wealth does not help them. Now, here are just two examples. Of course, there's many more. I think it's Timothy 6:10. I'm not an expert, that says the desire for money is the root of all evil. And here, this is fascinating. I don't know how many of you are plugged into political news about, well, in November, there was an election for the Georgia senators. There was a runoff election at the beginning of January. And one of the candidates was being attacked as a pastor, because he once gave a sermon where he said, you cannot serve God and the American military. And essentially that was being played on a loop as saying that he was against the American military. How could he be in the Senate? And I'm not going to get into whether he is or he isn't. I don't know the guy. But as a pastor, he was riffing on this verse from Matthew that says you cannot serve God and money, which is in Christian tradition, and it can be read in a number of ways. How can you read this in the most extreme way? You say you can't worship God and money at the same time. Those are mutually exclusive. If you have a love of money, you can't possibly love God. They just don't go together. It doesn't make any sense. It's like saying you cannot worship God and the devil. They are opposite forces. It can be read in a more nuanced way. You cannot serve God on money. How could you read that in a more nuanced way? Not to say that you can't worship these two opposite forces because they're mutually exclusive, but how else could you read this?
Will take up too much energy.
Okay, you could say it takes up too much energy, or you could say plug in money with anything. You can't serve God and money, meaning you can't, all you can do as a religious person is worship God. Nothing else can be worshipped. You can't serve God and family, you could say, meaning God is the ultimate attention of our service and everything else is in service to that. That could be read, and money kind of being the example as opposed to the principal culprit in this setup. So again, the pastor might have been saying you can't serve God and the American military. It could be read as he's saying those are opposite forces and the American military is evil and there's no way you can possibly come near God. It's like the devil. It could be read that way, which is how it was being played against him. In theory, he could claim, no, I'm just saying that you can't serve God and anything else. And actually, if you watch the context of his speech, he says you can't serve God and money, you can't serve God in the American military, you can't serve God and other things. It was more of a way, it sounded like, of saying God has to be the attention of our service and there should be nothing else that is on par with that. Everything else is a vehicle or a means for us to serve God. And of course, I mean, he won the election, and of course, that doesn't resolve the question, and I don't know what he meant, but that's just worth noting here. And I'm giving this here as an example of Christian tradition to do with money. You can't serve God on money. There's a couple of verses in Luke. There is still one thing lacking. This is when Luke speaks to an important pious figure who comes to him and says, am I doing well? Am I a pious person now? I've tried my best. And he says, you are pious, but there's one thing lacking. Sell everything you have and distribute it to the poor, and you will have riches in heaven. There is opposed wealth on earth and wealth in heaven. And he says, you've still got possessions, worldly possessions. You need to give them away. And essentially, this guy turns to Luke and says, yeah, not happening. I'm moving away and I'm keeping my money. And Luke says, fine, you won't get in because this is what happened. How hard is it? This is the famous parable that you may have heard used. How hard is it for the wealthy to enter the kingdom of God? It is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God. So we've got this huge weight in Christian tradition against wealth, material possessions. There is a lot of material for the ascetic tradition to feed off. suggesting that we should abandon our attachments. You can't serve God and money. It is hard for the wealthy to enter the kingdom of God. And here Dante is complicating that by saying, actually, avarice isn't the only sin. Prodigality is a sin. Giving away all your money without thinking is sin, because it is the Italian word misura, M-I-S-U-R-A, meaning measure, the Aristotelian idea of measure, moderation, the middle road, recognizing the value without casting it away or clutching it too tight. And in many ways, that is where we have a return away from gluttony, which is quite distant from Jewish thought as a kind of a major crime or sin, back to, in Dante, the view that Judaism probably takes to wealth. What is the Jewish view of wealth, other than give it all to me? What is the Jewish view of wealth? Good, bad, indifferent? Jonah?
I would say indifferent. Depends if you use it. If you use it for supporting Torah scholars and, you know, supporting your family, then it's good. If you use it for, I don't know, gambling, then it's not good.
Okay, excellent. Are there any prohibitions on wealth in the Torah, saying that we're not allowed to have it?
Kings are only allowed to have certain amounts of things.
Excellent. There is a prohibition on wealth, but only one person has a prohibition on too much wealth, and that's the king. And there are a number of checks and balances and constrictions on the king that do not apply across the sign, and it's more about the danger of power than it is about the danger of wealth. But there is a prohibition on wealth, and there is a danger seen there, but it's in the context of power, not the average citizen. In fact, in the Gemara Nadarim and elsewhere, suggests that wealth is a prerequisite to prophecy. You need to be strong, heroic, wealthy, wise, and humble in order to have the divine presence rest upon you. And everything we learn from Moshe. And then the Gemara Nadarim gives the psukim which show you that Moshe was a gibor, was an asher with a chacham and an anav. And of course, asher, you can say in rabbinic linguistic, doesn't mean materially prosperous. It might mean ezehu asher asamech bechalka. But there are a number of ways here, specifically when it defends Moshe as an asher, it speaks about the wealth he had, attitude he had. So wealth is clearly seen as a danger for kings, but also necessary for prophets. And I don't know how, I'll come to you 1 second, Ruben. I don't know how many of you sing after Havdalah any songs, but I didn't growing up, other than, Shavua Tov or Eliyahu Hanavi. That was it. But my in-laws sung this kind of longer song, which they sung when I was in yeshiva. Anyone sing any song after Havdalah? Two of you says kind of, which means his family mumbles it. Yes. Jonah?
We say Vayiten Lacha. I don't know. Some people might sing it though.
Oh, V'yiten Lacha, some people say in shul, some people say at home. That's true. And V'yiten Lacha is about what? To some degree, it links to Parnasa for the following week. And there is a song.
Mostly brachos and stuff.
Say again?
A lot of psukim about brachos.
Psukim about brachos, right? And there's a focus on there being a skula for saying it for Parnasa for the week to come. After Havdalah, I mean, I've seen families pick up the plate of grape juice and pour it in their pockets because they want to hold on to whatever they can. And that's, this is what my in-laws sing, what they sung in the Gush when I was there. Nobody sings this. Nobody sings this.
We do it in YU.
Are you doing it on YU? I was actually hoping Betsy could give us a round of this. But listen to the the person, the being.
Right now?
Say again.
You really want me to do it right now?
Do you sing it?
I don't, but I could sing it for everyone now if you really want.
I would love that.
Hama'avdil ben kodesh lecho. I need help, Rabbi. Chatseinu yimcho.
Zarenu v'chatzpeinu yar bekachol. Excellent. And what is astonishing, I mean, that was an astonishing performance, of course, which deserves a round of applause, It's an astonishing claim that we finish Havdalah. We're kind of in this enlightened spiritual state when we say, the being who separates sacred and the mundane, please forgive our sins. And then you can imagine saying, Zareinu Yarbek Achol, increase our seed, our children, our progeny, like the sand, like the stars of the night, which was the promise given to Avram Avinu. But we stick in a word, Zarenu, v'chaspeinu, Yarbek Achol, increase our children. What's v'chaspeinu? Kesef.
Money.
Yeah, increase our money like the sand. We put on par with the command to procreate, to have progeny, prosperity. And that's not because, again, stereotypically, we're all after money, but because we recognize in our tradition that there is value to money. And if we have money that we can put towards good causes, whether that is the support of scholarship or those who are poor, or medical research, or institutions that provide societies with the foundations to operate, whatever it is, money has value. It becomes a problem if it is used for illicit means. But that tends to be the Jewish tradition's view, which is at odds with the traditional Christian view, that avarice, that holding on to money is a problem. And Dante is kind of pushing back. And that's why Dante is kind of a key figure in terms of the history of Jewish thought as well. He has very little to do with Jews. Jews don't really get mentioned by him at all, but it coincides with some of the cultural resistance that he shows to traditional Christianity, with some of the more, I don't know if the word moderate is helpful, because that sounds like it's a concession, but some of the measured cultural convictions that is fed through Jewish tradition to do with some of these vices. And we have that in the context of wealth. Now, at the end of this canto, the end of this circle, when Dante gets to the end of the fourth circle, he has a conversation about fortune with Virgil. And I'll just note here that there are two views of fortune that he describes. One is the Romanized classical idea of fortune. And this is really to counterbalance, to say that Dante wasn't a rebel against Christianity. He was a solid Christian Catholic figure. He just presents some new adaptations. But the old view, the classical view of fortune, was a Roman god who is pictured here. What stands out about the god of fortune, the way that it's presented in this statue? What is noticeable about the figure?
That she's blindfolded?
Blindfolded, that's the key issue. And I think also the way she's kind of holding the money is indicative as well, is that fortune in the ancient classical world was seen as blind. Essentially, it is arbitrary, random. The way that she's holding the money is almost like she's dropping it unthinkingly. That's how fortune works. And that's how Virgil describes fortune, is these people were squabbling over fortune like it's something you might get lucky with. But here's the notion of fortune that was in the Christian tradition, which is how he Christianizes classical thought now. By fortune here is seen as an angel, essentially a minister of God, the way that Virgil describes it. Which is not blindfolded, but very much has the eye on the ball, quite literally. And this is the wheel of fortune, which is not just a nice family show, but a theological tenet, which is when you're at the top, you're actually about to head down. When you're at the bottom, you're actually on the way up, and everything is timed by providence precisely. So you shouldn't be squabbling over that. You should have patience and measure when it comes to wealth, fortune, prosperity, and recognize that everything is kind of determined. And Dante actually gets criticized here by some for giving way on the idea of free will, because it sounds like he's saying fortune is necessary. He actually uses the word necessary, that there's almost no free will. Everything is predetermined by providence. And the suggestion that to defend Dante is it's not necessary in the sense that it's predetermined, but it's a necessary tenet that providence exists. Otherwise, religion doesn't work. Now, at the end of this canto, canto 7, which we are going to finish, it's 4:12. We're doing excellent in terms of covering ground. So the end of this canto, he gets to see this crowd at the end of another river. This is now the river Styx. He got across the river Acheron. He now gets to the river Styx, which is in Greek myth, the river that leads to hell and the underworld. It is the river that appears in Disney's Hercules with all those souls in it. That's the river Styx. And he sees all these figures kind of clamoring towards the end, and he realizes he's now at the beginning of the fifth circle, the circle of wrath. He says, now let us go down even to greater pity. Virgil said to him, already every star is falling that was rising when I set out. Too long a stay is forbidden. It's midnight. We need to keep moving, Virgil says. You can't stay here and stay here and meditate on these people's suffering. We need to keep moving. So Dante now, as the poet says, we cut across the circle to the other side of the shore, beside a spring that boils and spills into a ditch leading away from it, that it spills away and there's kind of a drop on the other side. The water was darker than purple, and we, beside the murky wave, entered a strange descending path. Into the swamp called Styx goes his Stad's stream. And what did I see? I saw people muddied in that slough, all naked with indignant expressions. They kept striking each other, not only with hands, but with head and breast and feet, tearing each other apart with their teeth, piece by piece. And my kind master said, Virgil said, son, behold the souls of those who anger vanquished. And I would have you believe too, as a certainty, that under the water are people who are sighing, making the water bubble at the surface, as you I will tell you wherever it turns. So now we're still at the end of Canto 6. Virgil says there are two kinds of people in this river, in this circle. There are two kinds of wrath. There are what we call the sullen, which means kind of this repressed wrath that just has this long boiling wrath inside. And those who had the kind of bursts of anger that are on the surface. And those who experienced wrath in an expressive, exhibited, passionate way in their lives are sentenced for eternity to beat and gnash and claw each other on the surface. And those who were sullen and repressed are underwater, kind of gurgling, and their bubbles come out, and that's what makes this river look like it's boiling. There are people under the water sputtering, trying to speak. Now I see it's 4:15, and so we're going to have to, the beginning of next time, you'll have to forgive me, this is really, I'm sorry, beginning of next time we're going to finish off Canto 7, because we basically finished it. Well, begin Canto 8, where we finish off the Circle of Wrath. We'll end up in the city of Dis. Then we will try to get through Canto 9, 10, and 11 in somewhat rapid succession, touching on the questions of heresy, and hopefully that will lead us to finish 11 by Thursday. But in the meantime, as I said, if you've got any questions, you should feel free to reach out.